Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, where we provide tailor-made solutions for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies by improving their quality of life, and where we also provide tailor-made solutions to hospitals and intensive care units to save money and resources whilst providing quality care. In the last blog I shared another case study, and the case study was about Mary, who was in her late 60s, and she spent the last year of her life at home despite being intermittently ventilator dependent and on chemotherapy. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog I want to share another hot topic with you when it comes to long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care. And the topic this week is the 3 most dangerous trends facing long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies. With the ever-increasing numbers of adults and children surviving intensive care treatment and therapy, there comes an increase in numbers of people requiring long-term ventilation with tracheostomies. This also comes with huge challenges for intensive care units, their patients and their families. Often, long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care stay in ICU for far too long, or they don't get given the chance to get a tracheostomy in the first place, because intensive care units are worried that patients take up precious, expensive and in-demand intensive care beds for too long. After having worked in intensive care for nearly 20 years in 3 different countries, as well as after having worked with many long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in an intensive home care environment, I know that most long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies stay in intensive care for way too long and are denied quality home care for a number of reasons. Therefore, dangerous trends are emerging that need to be addressed in order to provide timely and cost-effective quality care that give patients and their families the best quality of life there is. Let's look at those dangerous trends in detail. Number 1. Long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies are not given choice and options. When long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies are in intensive care or long-term acute care for too long, they tend to be depressed because of their condition and their situation. Taking those patients home with a quality and accredited service like intensive care at home provides them with choice and options that provides a win-win situation, because intensive care at home is way more cost effective compared to a stay in intensive care or long-term acute care. And also it provides patients and their families with a much improved quality of life. And it provides patients, their families and hospitals with choice and options rather than the current one-size-fits-all approach. Number 2. Long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies and their families have no lobby and are being sidelined. If anything, they need strong advocacy. Most long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies have no lobby, and they often end up dying in intensive care, or they end up on a hospital ward on a ventilator being looked after by non-skilled and non-trained staff who look after people on ventilators and tracheostomies. If they are lucky enough to go home, they often end up being looked after by cheap and non-accredited service providers, with patients ending up with regular readmissions back to intensive care, because non-accredited and non-specialized service providers lack the skills and the know-how to look after their clients. Patients often end up in a vicious cycle with numerous and regular intensive care readmissions that could be prevented by going home with a quality service like intensive care at home. What also happens quite regularly is long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies going home with no support at all, leaving the burden on the family. Families are then often left with the dilemma of having to look after one of their family members whilst losing the ability to produce an income, and often also neglect other family relations. Again, intensive care at home can help with all of those issues, as we have a proven concept to keep long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies out of intensive care predictably, and we are strong advocates for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies and their families. Number 3. Many long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies end up with inappropriate treatment limitations, such as NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate orders. Many clinicians in intensive care are under the impression that life is not worth living when patients face long-term ventilation with tracheostomies. People have differing views, and that's great and needs to be respected. However, saying to somebody that living on a ventilator with tracheostomy is a life not worth living simply limits the options for people that want to live at home with the right support structure and with the right family support. Many clinicians in intensive care think that people on ventilators with tracheostomies have no quality of life, and that's simply not true. They certainly have no quality of life in intensive care, but they do have quality of life at home when looked after by a quality service like intensive care at home. What are your thoughts? Would you want your family member be at home or in a hospital when being long-term ventilated with tracheostomy? Leave your comments on the blog. For more information on how we can help you and your long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care, or if you have a family member in intensive care, you can ring us on one of the phone numbers on top of the website. We are also currently hiring enthusiastic and experienced intensive care nurses with critical care certificate. We would also like to hear from you if you have a minimum of 2 years pediatric intensive care experience, as we have opportunities there as well. For more information, check out our career section, or you can contact us on any of the phone numbers on top of the website. We are also a TAC and DVA Department of Veteran Affairs approved community service provider in Victoria, Melbourne. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog. This is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, and I see you again next week in another update.